Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar. My name is Lucy Moore and I'm a Professional Education Manager at ACCA. Our session today is designed to answer your questions about the Advanced Audit and Assurance exam, whether you're taking that exam by paper or CBE. And I'm really pleased to be joined by expert tutor Ben Wilson. To introduce Ben and explain how the webinar will work, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping points. At the bottom of your screen, there are a number of buttons you can use. A really important one on the left is a help icon, and this provides you with resources and information to help you solve any technical issues that you might experience throughout the webinar. There are also icons for the slides and media player, and you'll need to see both of these during the webinar, so make sure you've selected them. You can rearrange your screen to suit you, and you can also resize the windows. So if you want to make anything bigger, you can. If at any point you can't hear what we're saying or you can't see any visuals, then please refresh your browser. There's a resources icon as well. This one looks like a file symbol. And if you click on this, you'll see some resources relevant to today's session. For today, we're linking to the AAA resource area on the ACCA website, as well as giving you a direct link to some CBE specific preparation resources, just to help you if you are actually preparing to do AAA by CBE. Registering for this webinar means that you'll be sent an email tomorrow with details of how you can listen to it again. This is really important. We get asked this a lot during the session. Don't worry if you miss something or if you have any technical issues, because you will be able to access the recording. I'm now delighted to introduce your presenter for this webinar and also explain a bit about how the session will work. Ben has a wealth of both practical and exam audit experience. He trained at KPMG before moving into lecturing and examining, working with ACCA, also ICAEW, Kaplan and First Intuition. So you're going to hear more from Ben in a moment. I'll be handing over to him shortly. But just to explain how the session will work, this session is a dedicated Q&A webinar, and we'll be inviting questions in three areas. Firstly, exam technique, then technical, and then anything related to CBE specifically. And Ben will be answering a selection of your questions, starting off by answering some of the ones that we've received in advance. So some of you have submitted questions in advance as you registered for the session. So Ben will be running through a selection of those, and then he'll also be having a look at the questions that are coming through live, and he'll take some of those as well. We do have some ACCA staff working in the background to answer as many other questions as possible, but please note that we can't guarantee responding to all the questions we receive, either the advanced ones or ones coming through live on the session today individually, but we will do our absolute best to get through as many as possible. And if you'd like to ask a question on the session, then please select the Q&A button, the Q&A icon, and that will allow you to submit your question. So before I hand over to Ben, we're just going to start with a quick poll. And that question is asking you should see that popping up on your screen now. It's asking you what you find more challenging. Is it advanced audit and assurance technical knowledge or exam technique? Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be covering both of these areas in the questions that we're covering today. So don't worry, it doesn't matter which one you find harder. We'll be hopefully giving you some information to help you today. But we're really interested to know which it is that you find more challenging. So is that the technical knowledge or exam technique for this exam? Okay, I'll just leave that up there for a couple more seconds. And let's see what you thought. Okie doke. So what I'm seeing on my screen is just over 60% of you find the exam technique more challenging for AAA, and just under 40% the technical knowledge. That's really interesting. That's kind of in keeping with the other Ask the Tutor webinars that we've been running so far this week. It does seem that more students find the exam technique side of things harder. But at this point, I'm going to hand over to Ben to just reflect quickly on that poll results, and then he'll lead you through the rest of the session. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Lucy. So welcome everybody to this Q&A session. That split of is it exam technique or is it technical that's the big issue for the AAA exam? Well, your answer thereof, mainly it's the exam technique. That's really chimes actually, and that's really helpful and useful, because for this exam, it's the exam technique that really gets you through. Although there is some technical knowledge required, it's mainly about applying that knowledge to the long scenario-based questions, and that's the key to passing this exam. So if you remember just one thing out of this session, it's that practicing your exam technique on long questions is the key to passing. And the only way to get better at that exam technique is to practice, practice, practice. And so we're looking at doing full exam questions. My biggest bit of advice to you. So the session today is going to be broken into 3 parts. We're going to do exam technique questions, technical questions, and CBE. And we'll do, as Lucy said, a selection of pre-submitted questions, which we'll be running through now. And then also we'll be going through questions that are submitted during the session. So I'm just going to change the view so that you can see the slide. Okay, so exam technique, and these are some of the pre-submitted questions. There were loads that came in, so thank you everyone who did pre-submit a question. And lots of them were on similar themes, so I've kind of grouped them together. So the first theme of questions, and I've got lots on this, is how should you structure your answers and how much should you write? So in terms of structure, I would advise you to copy the exam requirement. So if you're in the CBE, take the exam requirement, and it will probably have 2 or 3 different parts in it, and use that for your structure, use that for your subheadings. If you're doing a paper-based exam, you just, you'll have to set up an area, a subheading for each part of the requirement. And how much should you write? So if it's a 10-mark question, you're looking at making 10 well-explained points to answer it. And a well-explained point is probably 2 full sentences. So for a 10-mark question, you're looking at writing something like 20 full sentences. Now, the examiner's model answers are much longer than that and much more detailed. And they're dangerous for you because you can't write that amount in the time that's available. So don't be looking at the examiner's answers and thinking, that's the amount I need to write to pass the question, because it really isn't. You can write maybe 1/3 to 1/2 of the amount that the examiner puts in the model answers and still get 80% in this exam. So 2 sentences per mark is what you're looking for. How do you manage your time effectively during the exam? This is a huge, huge problem area for students in AAA. And I think it's an issue because the scenarios are so long. There's so much to read, and very often there's so much to write. And so students really struggle to manage their time effectively, and they overrun on time and they don't get to finish the exam. And that's really damaging to your chances of passing, because so often there are easy marks at the end of the exam. So how do you manage your time effectively? You do it big picture and small as well. The big picture is you set yourself an amount of time for that whole question. So for section A, it's 50 marks. I'm giving myself half of the exam time, so about 1.5 hours for section A, and about 45 minutes for each of the section B questions, because they're a quarter of the exam. So I'm doing that kind of big picture, setting myself an overall time. And then for each individual requirement, I'm giving myself 1.8 minutes per mark. And I'm forcing myself to move on. So I know I've got 1.5 hours in total for section A, and I know how long I've got for each individual part, and I'm forcing myself to keep going. Those of you who are kind of doing the mental arithmetic there, my 1.8 minutes per mark and 1.5 hours, 45 minutes, that gets you to 3 hours, which gives you a 15-minute buffer time for things like reading and for something to go wrong. You've failed at AAA in the past, and unfortunately that happens to a lot of people. The pass rate is only about 30 to 35% for this paper. So if you failed in the past, what can you do differently this time around? First thing I would do is make sure you've gone back over the past exam questions for the exam that you failed. Now, I know that unfortunately, if you went down in September, you might not actually have the questions and everything available. But if it was an earlier sitting, go back over those questions, or certainly go back over. I think the questions are always available. It's the examiner's comments and answers that are not necessarily available. So going back over the paper and trying to identify where you went wrong is a really useful exercise. And if you're studying with an approved learning provider, it's well worth showing your answers to your tutor to get them to talk through it with you. So have another go at the exam. And then try to identify, just having another run at the exam isn't really the right approach. You've got to think about what you're going to do differently. One really good suggestion is try to use the technical articles that are on the ACCA's website. So use those as a kind of prompt for areas to go back over and study. And another good thing is to think about how you approach the exam on the day. Did you do section A first of all? And if you did, then perhaps you want to try a different approach next time. Section A, such a long scenario, so easy to kind of run over on time. Actually, you might be better starting with one of the shorter questions in section B. And so changing your approach to the exam could be the thing that helps you to get that 3 or 4 marks to boost you to a pass. Okay, do you need to do the questions in order? Absolutely not, you do not. Now, the examiner's advice is that you should do section A first. You should do the exam paper in order. My advice is that there isn't one set way to do this exam. The right answer is different to each student. So if English isn't your your first language, and if you struggle for time in the exam, then section A is the worst bit of the exam paper for you because it has really long requirements, really long scenarios. You are better to start in section B if English is not your first language or if you struggle for time. So do the questions in section B first, and then use the balance of your time to do the longer, more wordy scenario in section A. Within an individual question, if there's A, B, C, you don't have to do part A first of all. If you like the look of part C and you want to build up your confidence by doing the easy bit first, that's a great bit of exam technique. And actually that can be really helpful, particularly if you're running out of time. If you get to that last question and you can see that question C is easier, do that one first with the precious time you've got available. How much reading time should you allow? Now, I don't really have any specific reading time in AAA. The way that I approach the exam, and if you watched last week's recording of me going through an exam question, you'll have seen me doing this. I don't have specific reading time. I have planning time in each question. And my planning time is that I set up an answer plan in the platform software. So I set up my answer structure, and then as I'm reading through the scenario, I'm adding notes into my plan. So I'm not really doing any just reading time. My reading time is active. My reading time is read that piece of information and then put it into my plan somewhere. And the reason it's important to be active like that and to use the scenario in your answers is that in AAA, so many of the marks are for applying your knowledge, taking a fact out of the scenario and then running with it, making your answer bespoke. So it's important that you do that. How do you get the professional marks in section A? So report format, so title of like report or whatever, to, from, date, a really brief introduction where you are summarizing the question. You don't need to write the whole question out. Often people write far too much in the introduction. You can do it in 2 lines, just summarize the requirements. Then in your answer, you need to have a decent structure, subheadings, and clearly written points. Now, that's the hardest one to earn, the hardest of the 4 marks. And then the 4th mark is for having a concluding statement at the end of your report. So it's title, to, from, date, introduction, good structure and clarity, and having a conclusion. You've got to earn those 4 marks. Those are the 4 easiest marks on the exam paper. And if you don't get them, you're making this a much more difficult paper to pass. Why do so many people fail AAA first time around? Yeah, and a lot of people ask this question. This is a really tough exam, and it's so applied. Of all of the optional papers, it is the one that is most written, which students often find challenging. There's no numbers to fall back on, really. And it's the one that requires the most application of your knowledge. You know, quite often students look at AAA and go, oh, it's the same exam as AA, really. And I nailed AA at the lower level. And so I'll be fine with this one. I don't need to do that much work. And actually, AAA is a much more challenging exam than the lower level AA paper, because the scenarios are so much more involved. And the way that you have to prepare for this exam is to practice as many exam questions as possible. This isn't an exam that you pass by rote learning the textbook. This is the exam that you pass by practicing questions. And often students come to their question practice too late in the day. So take that message on board. From here on in terms of your revision, you should be practicing questions all the time. Okay, that's the pre-submitted questions on exam technique. I'm just going to go through a few of the questions that we've had during the session on exam technique. Anna has asked, should the answer plan be before or after answering the question? Okay, brilliant. Now, in the CBE software, I would leave your plan, and actually you don't submit your plan separately. Your plan, you kind of expand it out and write it up. But I would be, in the paper-based version, I'd be doing my plan first and then writing my answer underneath. But I'm doing it in the answer booklet so that the marker can see that I've planned, because it will impress them that I have done so. Can you use abbreviations? Mickey has asked. So things like SPL, FS. Now, in the report question with the professional marks, you run the risk that you lose a mark, that professionalism mark, if you over abbreviate. But in the rest of the paper, then you're fine to abbreviate for things like SPL or whatever. And if you're someone who struggles to structure your answer, and if you're struggling for time, abbreviate. I would, as long as it's like mainstream things you're doing. How many marks do you get per point? Farah has asked. Yeah, this is a really tough question to answer, because in something like the audit risk question, it will say up to 3 marks per well-explained risk. But what is it that makes a point well explained? Well, to be well explained, it has to start with a fact from the scenario, and then each extra bit of development, so each so what point that you make, that will get you up to an extra mark. So in something like the audit risk question, you'll get like half a mark to a mark for picking out the relevant fact, maybe half a mark or a mark for talking about the materiality of it, and then each bit of development you add will add an extra mark. So is it an over or an understatement? Is it which particular account specifically is it affecting? Is it which financial statement assertion? Is it a valuation issue? Is it completeness? Is it existence? Is it inherent risk? Is it control risk? Is it just, so every bit of extra detail that you add, every layer is another potential mark. Now, that makes it really hard to mark your own answers, because how do you know whether you got 1.5 marks worth of development or 2 or 3? And the best advice I can give you there is to make full use of your training provider. So make sure you're submitting your mocks for marking. Make sure you're using your tutor as a reference point. And the other thing you can look at is on the ACCA's website. There's a really useful resource called Inside the Mind of the Marker. And what that does is shows you some past exam papers and the marking of those. So they were actual student scripts, and the marker, the explanation document is the marker, an actual exam marker going, that was worth 1.5 marks because they did this, this, and this. It would have been worth 2 marks had they done that, 3 marks had they done this. Okay, last question on exam technique before we move on. What is the examiner's expectation of a student's answer? This has come from Noor. So I wanted to pick this question because the examiner's expectation of your answer is way lower, way less than they present in the examiner's model answers. So you're not trying to produce as much detail as in the examiner's answers because you just haven't got time to do that. What they're expecting you to do, Nor, is to take in each area, take a fact from the scenario and keep going with it, asking yourself the question, so what? So what does this mean? So what? So what? So what? And they're expecting you to write perhaps 2 sentences to explain each of your points in the exam. Okay, if there's any time left at the end, because there are some unanswered exam technique questions there, I will come back to exam technique, but we're going to move on to technical. Technical questions that were pre-submitted for AAA. So the first one I had was around, do I need to be quoting from the IASs? Do I need to know the numbers? Do I need to quote from them extensively? No, you don't. You do not need to be quoting numbers. In fact, don't waste time doing it. It's worth very little credit. You do need to have an understanding of accounting and auditing standards. But you're not trying to, in the examiner's answers, they often write out the accounting standard in real detail before applying it to the scenario. So for something like R&D expense being capitalized, they'll write out all of the capitalization criteria. So taking like a big paragraph and then apply it to the company's scenario. Now, you haven't got time to do that. Do not do that. There is not enough time to do it in the exam, and there aren't enough marks to make it worth doing. What you need to do is just pull out the 1 or 2 relevant bits from the accounting standard and then use the fact in the scenario to say whether it has been met or not. So if it's something like provisions, there's quite a lot of rules around whether you should recognize a provision, a past event, a present obligation that can be reliably measured. Now, I wouldn't be writing all of those out in the exam, though. If in the exam it's obvious that the amount can't be reliably measured, so the third thing has fallen down, I would only be saying that. So no provision should be recognised because because it cannot be reliably measured. We do not know the size of the potential outflow. So I'm not talking about the 2 that don't matter. I'm only talking about the 1 that is relevant in the context of this scenario. So knowledge is required, but do not be brain dumping lots from the accounting standards because it's not worth it. How can you earn a good mark for the ethics question? Okay, for ethics, it's all application, so discussion. But make sure you are using the appropriate ethical language. So talk about things like self-interest, self-review, familiarity. And I would, in an ethics question, I'm running through all of those as a checklist. Advocacy, self-interest, self-review, management, all of those, and that's my checklist for can I explain to me one of those things. And I'm also talking about the threats to objectivity. So things like things like your confidentiality, your objectivity, your professional behavior, so I'm kind of going through, I've got all of those things in my mind and I'm trying to see how I can relate those to the particular scenario. And I'm also making sure I'm talking about independence, objectivity, those kind of things. I'm using that language in my answers. They will expect you. So if you just said there's a self-review threat, you will not get the marks. You have to explain why it's a self-review threat. So there's a self-review threat because this tax number will be included in the financial statements, and the financial statements will then be audited, and the audit team will be more likely to accept the tax number at face value and less likely to highlight any shortcomings in the work because it would reflect badly on their own team. So you've got to explain yourself fully. Audit risks and business risks. Ooh, okay, good tips for those. So audit risks are reasons that we might sign the wrong audit opinion. We say the accounts are true and fair when they're not. Business risks is where there's a potential issue in the running of the company. There's a subtle difference between those things. So for something to be an audit risk is made up of 3 parts. Inherent risk, the risk that something goes wrong in the first place. Control risk, the risk that the company's systems don't prevent or detect this issue. And detection risk, that the auditor misses it somehow. Now, what I'm doing in an audit risk question is I'm starting with the fact from the scenario. I'm then saying whether it's an inherent risk, a control risk, or a detection risk, and explaining why. And then talking about whether it's an overstatement risk or an understatement risk. And I'm being specific about which exact account might be under or overstated, because I know that that will score me marks as well. And I'll also be trying to bring in any financial statement assertions. So things like completeness, existence, valuation, those kind of things. Because again, that's another thing that will pick me up another mark. I'm also trying to bring in a materiality calculation if I can. And if I can do all of those things, I'm going to get my 3 marks for explaining that audit risk. Audit procedures, what's the best technique for those questions? Because they come up in every exam paper. Okay, number 1, they have to be tailored. You cannot be rote learning tests for receivables and brain dumping them in the exam. That was the AA exam. For AAA, you have to tailor your audit tests using the specific details in the scenario. So what I'm doing in audit test questions, I'm making sure my tests are bespoke, they're tailored, and I'm saying exactly what I would be doing in my audit test and why I would be doing it. So, for example, I would physically inspect a building that the company owns. That's my audit test. And why I'm physically inspecting it, the explanation, is to confirm that it exists. And so that I can see the condition of the business to assess its value. And so I'm saying what I've done and why. And those things, that's how I get my marks for audit procedures. Should you use a table if there's risk and mitigation? Absolutely no harm in doing that at all. I quite like it when students do that because it means that for each risk they come up with a mitigation. But don't feel constrained by that. You can do all your risks and all your mitigations. But I tend to find that students score higher marks when they do them side by side. Implications. Loads of questions in the audit paper ask you to discuss the implications of something. So how do you come up with implications? So to come up with implications, I think of a few different things. Number 1 is, what does it mean going forward? So what does it mean for the future of the business? So what? What does it mean going forward? That's my first thing. The second thing I think of is there another part of the accounts that might be affected somehow? So an implication of winning a new customer and having a load of lovely sales coming in from them is an implication of that is that, well, I've got more receivables to collect, so I need to make sure I'm on top of that. And I might need more inventory to fulfill those sales. So I'm thinking about how other parts of the accounts are affected. The other thing I'm thinking of, my third area, is thinking of other stakeholders. How is another group affected by this? So what's the impact on my staff? What's the impact on my customers, my shareholders? And that's another way of me thinking of a development point, of thinking of another idea. How do you approach a reporting question? Now, these are, let you into a secret here, these are normally the worst answered questions on the exam paper. Now, I think that's so valuable for you to know, because if you know that that's the one that students do awfully on, even if you do just an all right answer, your script will really stand out as being, oh, this student knows what they're doing. Finally, an all right answer to the reporting question. They will throw marks at you if you do well on the bits that all of the other students don't do so well on. So in the reporting question, the biggest tip I can get you is practice as many past exam questions as you can on reporting. There isn't one set approach. It depends what the question is asking. But very often you're given an extract from an audit report and you're asked to critically evaluate it. And if that's the type of question, there'll be micro things that are wrong with it, like, you know, something's been labeled incorrectly, something's in the wrong order, a paragraph has the wrong heading or something like that. There'll be small issues, but there will also be big issues in the content. So when you read through the content of the audit report and the scenario, it won't be, it will be the wrong kind of audit report. You know, they'll be saying there's a material misstatement because of a disagreement with management, when actually in the scenario, it turns out there's a lack of sufficient appropriate audit evidence because we couldn't audit inventory because there was a fire, destroyed the records or something. So look for fiddly things like it being in the wrong order and the wrong headings, and then really involve yourself in the content to identify the kind of bigger picture issues. Okay, last question on technical. Should you be bringing in things like COVID, Brexit, the state of the world economy? If you do, make it one small point. Do not make your answer a long pre-written thing about COVID and the impact on the company. The exam questions they're all written a long way in advance. So the questions you'll be sitting now will have been written before COVID was such a significant issue. And so the answers will not be expecting you to write about current events. Okay, let's have a look at some of the technical questions that have come in during the session. Okay, Rue has asked one about key audit matters. When do you have a key audit matters paragraph? So you have a key audit matters paragraph in the audit report when it's a public interest entity, so normally for a listed company, and it's an extra paragraph or actually an extra section of the audit report where the auditors do things like pick out what were the significant risks that they identified in the business and therefore how they adjusted their audit plan as a result, and a kind of summary of what they more detail about what they did during the audit. And the idea is if you're someone who's a layperson and you don't really understand financial statements and audit reports, you can read that CAM section and it will give you more of an idea of what happened during the audit to increase public credibility. But yeah, so you use one. Any company could include a key audit matters paragraph, but it tends to be just for public interest entities, so listed companies. Are there any technical articles to focus on? Not particularly. I mean, the ones on audit reporting are probably the ones that I would focus more on because it's the more kind of techie area of this syllabus. But the exam is so applied that the technical knowledge isn't really where it's at. The practicing exam questions is the key. In section A, what am I expecting to come up? Now, you never know what's going to come up in this exam, but one thing that almost always happens in section A is you get a big audit risk question. So you're having to pick out of the scenario audit risks, and that'll be 15 to 20 marks generally in section A. So practicing some past exam questions, you will see that, and you will get good at answering that type of question. So make sure you do that. So if an audit risk question is 24 marks, does it mean 8 points are enough? Kartik has asked this question. So if it's 8 points that you've made and there are 3 marks per well-explained risk, then yes, if all of your risks have been really well explained, that would get you to 24 marks. Now, in the real world, each of yours isn't going to be well explained. Sorry, I mean, Kartik, you might be the prize winner, but for the mere human beings amongst us, then some of our points are only going to be worth 1 mark. Some might not even score at all. So for a 24 mark audit risk question, yes, I would be looking to bring up at least 8. But what I'm being very careful of, Kartik, is going, you know what, there are actually 10, 12, 14 risks in the scenario. If I try and write up all of those, that is a recipe for disaster because I will overrun on time and I won't get through the exam paper. So limit yourself to your best 8. Mohammed has asked, when you're explaining audit risk, do you bring in accounting standards? Yes, but only in a limited fashion. So just bring in a little bit. For audit evidence questions, should we start from a verb? JK, yeah, I love that point. So when you're suggesting an audit procedure, an audit test, start with a verb like inspect or analyze or discuss. Yeah, I really like that. That's a great approach. Yeah. But don't make that verb check because the examiner hates that. Check is too vague. It needs to be a specific verb, a precise verb. Okay, one more question. Okay, would I mind elaborating on inherent risks? Because I struggle to identify them in the exam questions. Okay, inherent risks. An inherent risk is the risk that something goes wrong in the first place, that a mistake happens in the numbers. And sources of inherent risk will be the nature of the business's trade. So you're looking for things like the industry that they're in. They go down to kind of being more micro about the kind of the specific areas of that company's accounts. So if it's something like I don't know, they're in a fast growth high tech industry, then they are applying for a bank loan or something. There's an inherent risk that some of the numbers will be wrong because they're fast changing, or there's an incentive to overstate them. So the inherent risks are things that could cause a problem to happen in the first place. Like, I don't know, we're looking to take out a bank loan. That therefore gives the directors an incentive to overstate revenues and understate costs to boost the profits, to make it more likely that they get the bank loan. So I'm looking for specific things out of the scenario. Okay, I can see they've got lots of unanswered questions there. So if there's time at the end, I will come back to technical, but looking at the pre-submitted questions on CBE. So if it's your first time doing a computer-based exam, what advice would I give? Practice, practice, practice. Practice is critical. It's an unusual way to be sitting an exam. You know, if you've always done written exams, sitting the CBE is hard. It's a change. So you need to use all of the resources that are available to you. Now, on the ACCA's website, there are 3 full past exam papers that are loaded up into the practice platform software. So make sure you do all 3 of those. And that gets you used to doing things like organizing your screen, so where you put the various exhibits, and it gets used to you planning in the software, so that if you run out of time in the exam, then your plan gets submitted and you potentially earn some marks. The other thing I would say is, on the practice platform website, there's a blank workspace, and you can be practicing your general questions. So not just the 3 full exams that are on there, you can be practicing other questions in the software to get used to it. Can you copy and paste from the exhibit into your answer? Yes, absolutely. Definitely the requirement. Do that to get your answer structure. And if there's any long bits you want to quote, copy and paste them rather than typing it out. It's quicker. Yeah, absolutely fine to do that. But know that just copying and pasting isn't really going to get you any marks. It's your analysis that's important. Section A is really hard in the CBE format. It is. You have my sympathy. There's a lot of information for you to read through, and it's challenging to get it all up on screen. So my advice is, you've got to organize your screen thoroughly, effectively. So you have on one side your answer, the word processor, and on the other side you start with the requirements, and then so once you've got the requirements up, you copy and paste those into your answer. I'm then getting rid of the requirements, and I'm bringing up each exhibit in turn, and I'm going through that exhibit and putting notes into my answer as I'm reading each exhibit. So I'm working through each exhibit in turn, adding notes into my answer. And then once I've done my planning like that, I then type up my answer. So you have my sympathy. It is hard to organize your screen effectively in Section A, but the only way you get better at it is by practicing. Okay, so make sure you're doing those 3 past exams that are on the platform. Do you need to use the spreadsheet for this CBE? Not really. It's not really a numbers exam. You get some marks for things like your materiality calculations in Section A, but frankly, I would just be using my calculator to do those numbers. It's not really worth doing them in the spreadsheet. You can if you want to, but it's probably just as quick for you to just do them in the calculator and type them in. Okay, so this is a general point about the CBE. Most people type more slowly than they write. So do the examiners get that? And then and actually we've answered that question already about why people fail it first time around. So do the examiners understand that it's hard for you typing your answer? Now, I would you'll be surprised at this answer I'm going to give. Students write much better answers when they are typing rather than when they're handwriting. When a student handwrites, most students waffle because they can write quite quickly. they're writing and thinking at the same time, and they end up with a scribbly answer that's really long and waffly and hard for the marker to understand. When the student is typing, because they're slower at typing, they tend to think a bit more first and then type their answer. So they write less and they don't fill their answer with waffly stuff. So actually, you end up with much more precise answers when students type. So I actually disagree with the premise of this question. Students write better answers when they type. And I can tell you that, so from my experience of seeing student scripts as handwritten and seeing them typed, they actually do better when they're typed. So bear that in mind. I guess what is there to gain from you for knowing that? Writing a shorter, more precise answer is more effective in this exam. You still need to write full sentences. It can't be little bullet points, but so you need to fully explain yourself. But it's a really good idea, even if you're doing the handwritten exam, it's a really good idea to plan your point first before you start writing it. And then having micro thought about what you're going to say, then quickly get your answer down on paper. What I wouldn't advise you to do is to be thinking too much as you are writing your answer. If you're trying to generate the point and write it at the same time, it becomes waffly. Okay, so we're going to go through some more of the, are there any CBE questions? Okay, so we've only had one CBE question that's come in actually around, can I answer submit the requirements? Then yes, you so yeah, you can copy and paste the requirements into your answer. You can do. Okay, so I'm going to go back for the time we've got available. We've got quite a few unanswered technical and exam technique questions. Well, actually a couple. So on the technical, will the examiner still ask business risk and audit risk separately? Now they won't ask you to do both business risk and audit risk in a particular question. The much more frequent question is audit risk, but they could ask you about business risk separately, but probably not in the same requirement. The difference between audit risk and business risk is inherent risk and control risk. So that's the risk that something goes wrong in the first place and the company's systems don't stop it from happening. Audit risk is the risk that then the auditors don't find that problem. And that's the extra layer that's added on for audit risk. James has asked, do I suggest revising F8, the audit and assurance paper? At this stage, I wouldn't recommend revising anything. I would be practicing past exam questions. And if I find a question that I can't answer because I lack the technical knowledge, I would then be going and filling in that knowledge gap, going back to my textbook. So at this stage, I would say it's too late to be going, right, now it's time to start learning stuff. Do it the other way around. So I would describe this as exam-focused learning, which is practicing a question, having a proper go at it, and if I've had a problem in part of that question, I couldn't answer it because I lack the technical knowledge, I then look that bit up. So I'm filling in the gaps that way. That's much more efficient for you than trying to learn the syllabus at this stage. How can we distinguish between ethical issues and professional issues? And there's a big overlap between those, right? So your ethical issues are things like confidentiality, integrity, that kind of stuff. And your professional issues are things that, might bring bad reputation onto your audit firm, or might bring the firm into disrepute in some way, which will probably be driven by one of those ethical issues. So if the question is asking you about both ethical and professional issues, I would probably answer the two together. Professional issues are just things that, as a bit wider, perhaps, than just pure ethical issues. But for those kind of questions, my starting point for everything is the facts from the scenario. So if it's ethics and professional issues, just pick out the specific things that sound a bit dodgy from the scenario and run with them, and you will pick up the marks that way. Is there a difference between other matters and emphasis of matter paragraphs? Okay, and other information. So these are all extra bits that happen in an audit report. So an emphasis of matter paragraph is an extra paragraph where the auditors say there's a problem in the accounts, in the financial statements. These things are whopper. We want to draw your attention to it. Make sure you look at note 12 in the accounts, because there's a really big issue. The accounts are okay. You know, they're not qualified. There's not, you know, they haven't done anything wrong, but you really want to know about this. So that might be something like, you know, there's been a huge legal case and it's been correctly provided for, but, you know, we want to make sure you read that because it's such a whopper, such a big issue. The second type of is an other matters paragraph. So other matters is when there is a problem or something to draw your attention to, but it is not in the financial statements. So that might be something like the chairman's statement, the director's report at the start, the integrated reporting stuff at the start of the accounts, all of that PR stuff at the front of the accounts, that might not be consistent with the actual accounts. In which case, well, the accounts have been audited, we're happy with those numbers, but the director's report might say, it's been our best year ever. And actually, it's been a rubbish year, and the numbers don't support it, the director's statement. So your other matters paragraph would say, you know, the accounts state, the director's statement says that it's the best year ever, and actually the accounts don't show that. So you're drawing attention to something that is not in the financial statements. Or, you know, more mundane, it might be that the parent company reports under a different set of accounting standards to the subsidiary company. You know, one might be a local GAAP, the subsidiary company, and the parent company might be under IFRS. And so there's, you know, they would be drawing attention to that. Okay. Oh, there's so many to go through in here. Okay, so Daniel was asked, what's the difference between a risk of material misstatement and an audit risk? Great question, Daniel. So this is the same really as business risk and audit risk. Risk of material misstatement is inherent risk and control risk. So the risk that something goes wrong in the first place and the company's systems don't prevent or detect it. Audit risk is those first two things, business, the inherent risk that something goes wrong, control risk the company's systems don't stop it, and crucially, that the auditor misses it. So for something to become an audit risk, the difference between those two things is that the auditor misses it for some reason. Abdullah, yeah, it is possible to have business risk and risk of material misstatement in question one. Absolutely it is. The more normal question is on audit risk, but you could get that. Okay. Are there any tips to approach quality control questions? So in a quality control question, you're looking, and this applies to so many questions actually in the AAA exam, you're looking at responding to the specific facts that have been given in the scenario. So you will be told about problems, and your job is to kind of explain why that's an issue and perhaps what you would do about it. But don't go in there with a kind of pre-prepared list of things you're trying to look for in a quality control question. Much more that you're looking at the specific document or a bit of analysis that you're given and responding to the specifics of it. I'm just going to look in the exam technique questions area, just see if there's any good ones in here before we close up. We've got a couple of minutes of time. I know we're supposed to finish at 1:45, but I'm allowed to go up until 10 to. So when I calculate numbers in AAA, do I need to show my calculations? Now, the point of showing your workings in something like a materiality calculation, the point of showing those workings is so that it's obvious to the marker what you've done. And so I probably would just type out my working. But you know, in this exam isn't really a numbers paper. There will be a few marks for those calculations, so don't worry about it too much. And if you don't show your workings and just say, you know, this receivable balance is 8% of profit before tax, and therefore it's highly material, and don't show your number, your calculation, you just say the 8%, you'll probably still get the credit anyway, because there's only going to be half a mark to a mark for doing that calculation. So I've got someone saying that their mark has got, so they got 44 in one attempt, 36 in the second attempt, and now it's third time around. What do they do differently this time? And I'll kind of use this question to kind of summarize for everybody, actually, what I would be doing between now and the exam to maximize your chances of passing, whether you are resitting or sitting for the first time. Okay, my best bit of advice to you is that you need to develop and build your exam technique. And the only way to do that is to practice exam questions fully. So that means doing them to time. So you're getting past exam questions. And I mean, ideally, you're doing whole exam papers, but as a minimum, you're going, right, I'm going to do a section B question here. I've got 45 minutes. I've got 45 minutes, and I'm going to do a full written answer for it. And I'm going to go through, I'm going to do that properly, because that will help me to build my technique. So you're practicing questions to time, and either you're perhaps reviewing another student's answers because you've got a study buddy, or you're perhaps chatting to your tutor to get them to give you some insight into your answer. But as a minimum, you're going through your own answer and auditing it compared to the model answer and looking for things that you missed, things you could have improved on. But practicing questions to time and practicing entire exam papers to time are the two best things that you can do to develop your exam technique, and it is your exam technique that will see you through this exam. So don't focus on revising, do focus on doing exam questions. That's my best tip to build your chances of passing. Okay, thank you everybody for all of the questions that you pre-submitted, and for the ones during the session. Apologies I wasn't able to answer all of them, but what I've tried to do there is pick a selection that cover, you know, wide range of the kind of questions that students have answered. So the very best of luck for your exam at the start of December.
Thank you, Ben.